All right, so we are recording. Jason, I'll turn it over to you and we'll go from there.
Great, thanks. Yeah, excited to present this as well. And I will tell you, machine learning has been something that I've been looking at for a while in the program. And some of you all know my story, but how this kind of came to be was midway through the program. And I've always been somebody that thought, hey, I'm going to be a tenure track finance professor in a business school. Like that's what I wrote in my initial essay. That's kind of been the plan. I teach for KU in the School of Business. And midway through the program, we started to talk more about firms that are hiring people to do research. And at the same time, I also learned that there's these folks out there called data scientists, right? And, if you can get the right training and the ability, like if you have a PhD, it doesn't matter if you're a PhD in data science, you can go become a data scientist. And at the same time, I saw a few papers pop up that started to have machine learning in the title, which it's interesting sitting in my seat. I'm here in Lawrence in the business school right now. And many of my colleagues in finance, like the finance literature has been using machine learning and some of these advanced techniques for a long time. And that's what's so fun about being in personal financial planning is we get to pull over so much stuff just because we're so new that no one's used it before. And so interestingly in the program, I've become the person who does all the weird stuff, which I kind of like. It's like my method to the madness, I guess. And so I've started to look into things like using R and Python and machine learning methods and textual analysis and sentiment analysis and pulling from data sets like Twitter and geospatial analysis using things like QGIS and R. So I'm like the weird researcher that likes to do stuff and bring over theories we've never heard of before. And I think it's fun and exciting to do things that nobody has ever done before. And so we have a unique opportunity to do that. So anyway, without the lecture at the beginning here, what are we talking about here? Predicting authorship using financial designations. And this is really something that got birthed out of an initial paper. And it's kind of basically we did this one paper, and this was one slice of that paper that I kind of held to the side and told my co-authors, hey, I want to do more on this specific piece. And they said, yeah, go ahead, because I think we were done with the paper at the time. We were like, let's just get it published. You can have that other piece. And so I'm finally doing something with that other piece. So who are my co-authors? Andy Doto, which I do not believe is on this call, is somebody that I met during an internship over the summer who is a master's of science in data science. So this guy has been trained on how to do the stuff, and he's our lead when it comes to the machine learning analysis. Joanne Wu, who I do not see here, and then Dr. McCoy, who I believe is on the call to figure out what the heck it is we've been doing. So, that should be fun. And you'll get a good chance to see what's going on. And the funny thing is this is about predicting authorship topics based on credentials like JD, CFP, CPA, things like that. And most people might think that's a little bit boring or kind of obvious. Actually, I told my wife about some of the results, and she said, oh yeah, that's obvious. And I was like, but it's so fascinating, like, and so she just was like, you're kind of dumb, Jason, whatever, like this is pretty obvious. Of course lawyers write about tax, like, way to go, buddy, they pay you for this. And so it is what it is, but I think it's really fascinating. So this came from actually many first years on the call. You probably read our article surveying the Journal of Financial Planning. And you saw some of the things that we did for that journal article. And this is one of the things that we did for that journal article was looking at machine learning to categorize topics. And this is a method of machine learning. It's based on artificial intelligence, where we kind of hierarchically ranked different keywords within the Journal of Financial Planning. So we're going to continue to do that with the machine learning that we did today, but we did that in the initial article as well. Using R in a package called Quantata. So what is machine learning? Let's just start there from the beginning. And this is very broad. There are many types of machine learning. There's unsupervised and supervised and all this other technical jargon. But I just want to distill it down to something that's very simple. So it's a subfield of artificial intelligence. So the idea there being that, sometimes these are just basic algorithms and sometimes they work on their own. They have their own intelligence that they can search through things, which is why sometimes you hear of at least some machine learning models being black box. In other words, we put in data, the machine learning model learns and iterates and does kind of trial and error, and it spits out something, and we can't really look at what it did in the middle. And we can't really explain it. And so we can show you metrics of what happened and what it identified, but sometimes we actually can't even explain what the machine learning model has done. So that lack of explainability can be a challenge in academia where we literally wanted to find everything in a paper. It is focused on prediction, which is actually one of the reasons why I love it so much. Is in academia, we tend to be historic looking. We'll take like HRS or some other data set and we'll look back and we'll say, what are the relationships? And that's cool. Don't get me wrong. I have some papers published doing that type of thing. But I actually am really fascinated by predicting stuff, which has its own implications in terms of what we can do in the field, right? Which is really interesting. And so machine learning is more, in my opinion, more forward looking in terms of prediction versus retrospective and looking at causal and even just kind of relational aspects of data. I will just tell you, if any of you all are on this call because, and you're likely just here to write a report, right? But if you're on this call because you think it's really interesting, I will tell you it's fascinating. I was talking with one of my friends who is a PhD in strategy, literally like kind of the quintessential consultant, and we were talking about machine learning. And sometimes machine learning is basically what we've already learned in this class. They just call it different stuff. So for instance, they will have a dependent variable and they'll call it a feature. They'll have an independent a dependent variable, they'll call it a target. They'll have independent variables and they'll call them features. And they'll say, hey, I've got this really cutting edge machine learning model. I'm going to do a logistic regression. And you're sitting here like, wait, what? Like, that's not cutting edge. Like, I do that. So some machine learning, like you've probably never done before, you don't know what it is, but actually some of it you've done and people have just repackaged it as machine learning. So take heart, you may actually know more about machine learning than you think you do. And then finally, just one other thing that I would say here is one of the things about machine learning that's different from the way that we approach research is, since it is about prediction, what will happen is you'll take a data set and you'll figure out, what am I trying to predict? So for us, it's like predicting the type of author or credential or topic or whatever. And we will split the data set into like 70-30. And so 70%, we will train the model on the 70%, and it will learn as it trains through that model. And then we keep 30% to actually see how good it is at predicting after it's trained on 70%. You with me so far? And so a lot of the metrics that we're reporting on are, we've trained the model on the 70, and now we're seeing how good it is at identifying stuff in the 30%. And so we'll talk about that as we go along here. So what is the data? The data is based off what we pulled for that journal article, but the initial journal article for JFP, but we've expanded it pretty significantly. So we've pulled for the Journal of Financial Planning, and I have it actually dated out, but basically like 13 years of journal article data. That data includes title, abstract, authors, document type, date, subject terms. Now we don't use all this, but it is included in the data set. And then I realized, and let me back up. So the authors piece has credentials from about 2008 to 2020, which is the most recent full year we have. When you look at the authors column, it has credentials. So it says CFP, it says JD, it says AIF, it says AEF, it says CHFC. I mean, it has all the credentials, which is really cool. At least I think it's cool. And so that's where we're pulling the credential data. And then I figured out that ProQuest, two other journals in personal financial planning, have that data as well. And it's the Journal of Personal Finance and the Journal of Financial Service Professionals. And so I went back and I pulled about 13 years of data from those two journals that have all the credential information and all the article information, et cetera. So all this is pulled from ProQuest Academic. And if you're wondering, this is CSV, so it's not formatted very well, but this is kind of what it looks like in Excel. You have the title, you have the abstract, which of course this is really long. You have the authors, and if this column was expanded out, you can see that it includes, in many cases, credentials like PhD, CFA, CPA, CFP, of course, we're concerned about it as a document type, all that good stuff. So not a huge data set in terms of its width of things that we're looking at, but it does have about 5,000 records, which is pretty cool. We get to go through and figure out over basically 5,000 articles. We can pull all this data that we're looking at. The machine learning was done in Python, specifically a package called sklearn, very common in industry that individuals use this. The features are coded from the abstracts. And so we're basically pulling keywords from the abstracts. It's one of the things that this machine learning model does, is it pulls some of those main keywords and it vectorizes them, meaning that it makes it into a format that we can train a machine learning model on. And then our targets are grouped by credentials. And so what does that look like? Well, let's go to targets first. So we have we've essentially created 3 groups, and then we have eventually distilled that to 2 groups to increase the efficacy of the model. But we have, at least in the initial run, we have 3 target groups. We have academics, which we've defined as PhD authors with no additional credentials. So if you look at, if there's 3 authors, they're all only going to be PhDs. Then we have practitioners, which include no PhDs, okay? So no PhDs at all, and all 3 of the authors, all 2 of the authors, 1, whatever it looks like. Then we have both, which is everything else, which this would include maybe a PhD and some other things. So that's what we started with, but you're probably already looking at this and thinking, okay, so there's some problems here, okay? Like this doesn't clearly define academics versus practitioners. And by the way, there is no smoking gun here or silver bullet. There is no way to totally nail it down. Because I mean, a JD might be a practitioner, they might be an academic, same with PhD. We can't fully nail this down, but we're going to try to get close. So the second model that we ran was actually just looking at 2 groups. So it's a bivariate target. And again, target just is a fancy way of saying dependent variable. We're trying to figure out academics that have any PhD across the author list. And then the second group is no PhDs across the author list. Okay, with me so far? So this is essentially what we're trying to predict with the machine learning model is, are you an academic or are you a practitioner based on the abstract keywords? That's kind of the idea here. So the features, again, this is just saying the independent variables, we're vectorizing those abstracts. That turns it into what's called a term frequency inverse document frequency matrix, or that's the algorithm that we're using, and it turns it into a vectorized keyword abstract. And so we can essentially use that to predict whether you're a practitioner or an academic. So here's the results. And again, the way machine learning works is that we're trying to predict something. So I'm essentially, these aren't the results yet. These are the target distributions. So when we talk about 3 groups, we're looking at, when we did that first 3 group split, we have about 141 academics, 884 practitioners, and then 158 that are both. You might be saying, hey, this doesn't add up to 5,000, and you would be correct. The reason why that is because you have to have a credential and you have to have an abstract to be included in this analysis based on how we're doing it. And if you know anything about the Journal of Financial Planning, they include all sorts of random stuff like stat banks and table of contents and all sorts of other things that are not going to include credentials, not going to include abstracts. Also, you may have authors that don't have any credentials, and so they wouldn't be included here. So that's why this looks so different from the 5,000 that I talked about earlier. Okay, so when we look at 3 groups, again, with machine learning, we're trying to predict stuff. And so we try to figure out, hey, how good is this model at predicting whether someone is a practitioner or an academic based on those keywords? We also have 3 different models that we used. And again, I told you, sometimes we call it machine learning and you already know what it is, logistic regression. Now, this is an interesting one because it's one versus the rest. So we're kind of running it on 3 different groups. So it is a little bit kind of robotic in that respect, I guess, but it's not anything new. We also have a naive Bayes classifier. We have a decision tree classifier, which is kind of an if this, then that type of machine learning model that goes through and branches out decision points. And then we have a random forest, which is kind of similar. So trying to group these 2 based on keywords and see how good it is. So Here we have average weighted precision. So this is across those three groups. How well did the machine learning model do? And then we have average weighted recall. So you might be asking yourself, what is precision and recall? Well, I'm glad you asked, okay? So if you know anything about statistics, there is something about like a false negative, false positive, true negative, true positive, right? We kind of talk about this when we do hypothesis testing, because we don't want to, for instance, reject a null hypothesis when it's actually we shouldn't have. So we kind of can break it up into categories where we might have a false negative, a false positive, etc. And so precision is essentially just a way where we can take those true positives, we can divide it by the actual results. Recall is true positive by the predicted results. Accuracy is true positive plus true negative divided by the total. And so we're kind of looking at different ways like, okay, is the machine learning model able to identify a target, but then can it also identify what's not a target, right? Because you could have a really accurate machine learning model, for instance, that only identifies, is good at identifying things just because it identifies every record as that, right? And so that's not a good model. We need something that can balance between identifying the right records and then rejecting those that are not. And so just without getting into too much technical detail here otherwise, you can see we've got models across these. You can see the best one in terms of precision is this Bayes classifier. You can also see across recall, the best is going to be just a logistic regression. And it's about 70% accurate in identifying whether you're an academic or a practitioner. About 70%, we'll just call it 70% here. So not terrible, but also not great. If we're talking 50-50 here, you know, we're beating the odds, but not by much. And so you see this and you're like, hey, this is cool. Not really sure this is something I could deploy, right? And so this is why we also thought maybe it's because we defined the groups improperly to begin with. It was a little bit wonky. And actually, Andy came up with it. He's not on this call, so I can kind of blame him. And I kind of told him, I'm like, I'm not sure that's great. So let's do just PhDs and non-PhDs. Like, let's make that the classifier. And so when we redid that, you can see that we've got 915 academics now. We have 1,522 that are practitioners, and then we have 2,600 that don't have any credentials at all. But we've got better numbers here. I think it's probably a better classification. And so when we reran the models here, you can see, and by the way, I've added accuracy here. We'll go back and recode where we get all three of these on all of them, but we didn't do accuracy to begin with. I told Andy, hey, we should do accuracy. And so you can see we get better results here. So when we just do two groupings, we now are up to closer to 80%. And sometimes we're going like up to 90%, like on a random forest for a recall. Like this is pretty good right here, this random forest where we're at about 0.75, and then we've got some really good recall. So this is a pretty good model right here. We're doing pretty well in terms of a machine learning model in terms of classification. So, all right, so that's the machine learning piece. And then I said, hey, that's pretty cool. I'm glad I did this. This is publishable. But I also, kind of my initial thought of why I wanted to do this paper is I kind of had this idea that if you're a CFP, are you more likely to write about tax, right? Or we would expect a CPA to go write for the Journal of Financial Planning and write about tax all the time, right? Like I kind of wanted to test whether that was true. And also there's a few that you don't really know what they write about. Like you expect a lot of CFPs to write for the Journal of Financial Planning, but what are they writing about? And what are they more likely to write about? And I don't know why, but I find this really fascinating. It's like, this is my one research topic that most people are like, this is very strange, Jason. Like, why are you fixated on this whole credential thing? But I find this like really interesting. I don't know why. It's really interesting to me. So I wanted to dig more. I'm glutton for punishment. So I'm like, how can I tease out this question? So this is phase 2 of this by doing a regression analysis to try to answer that question. And so we did do some modifications, but I essentially pulled the top credentials across all these 5,000 records. And then one modification I made was when JD is one of those top credentials, by the way. We're going to look at the top 5. And so for the top 5, when it comes to JD, I added Esquire and LLM as well to get a better understanding of this kind of idea of study and practice of law. So that is one modification I made. JD, when we talk about lawyers, we're actually talking about everything. And I missed a slide. Shame on me. Okay. So the slide that I missed was the top 5 credentials. And so the top 5 credentials, when we went through and looked at all the credentials and all the authors, the top 5 were JD, CFP, CHFC. What are my other ones? Oh, here we go. They're on the slide. CFP, PhD, lawyer, which is that JD, LLM, Esquire combo. Then we have CLU, chief, chartered life underwriter, which is interesting. What do you think they write about? I wonder. Probably about insurance, don't you think? Well, we'll see if that's the case. And then CHFC, which is kind of like a CFP, right? And then I wonder what the lawyers write about. This is very interesting, right? So we're going to see all this play out. Okay, so what? And then I said, okay, based on previous research, we know what some of the main keywords are in the Journal of Financial Planning, because we did that research in that initial piece. So we know that some of the top keywords are financial and income and retirement and I think taxes in there, and so some other ones. And I was like, well, I kind of want to do a broader search here. And so what does this align with? Well, interestingly enough, it aligns with the CFP knowledge topics. And so the CFP 2021 core knowledge topics are ethics, financial planning, general principles of financial planning, risk management and insurance, investing planning, tax planning, retirement planning, estate planning, and then this new one that they've thrown in there, which is psychology, which, I wonder who talks about psychology. So interesting. We got to get to the results. Oh, man. It's such a cliffhanger. And so anyway, so I took all those topics and I pulled the keywords. I pulled sometimes multiple keywords. So for instance, for that first category, I did ethics and regulation. For insurance, I did a search for risk and insurance. For investing, I just did invest, so I could encompass investing and investors. So anyway, I'm searching for keywords to try to figure out when articles are essentially written on these topics. And so what I do is I search the title and I search the abstract for these keywords. And that's kind of my proxy for saying this article is written about tax, or it's written about insurance, or it's written about what have you. So are you with me so far? Good to go. Okay, so now what I did is, before I did the analysis, is I did binary variables. So we call these dummy variables. And I did these on each of those topics. So if the title or the abstract included the word tax, it is a 1 in terms of tax, okay? And it's a 0 if the title or the abstract do not contain the word tax, okay? And then on the credential side, if anybody in the article, any of the authors are a CFP, it is a 1 for CFP. If no one in those authors are a CFP, it's a 0, right? So I have kind of a binary credential that tells me what credential is in that author title, or in the authors. And then I have a topic, which is a 1 and 0, saying, hey, is this about tax or not? So we're still with me so far. Okay, and then it's a logistic regression because we're a 1-0 binary variable. And so here we go. Now, I can tell you, when we do a logistic regression, it's a little bit hard to interpret. This is one of the few times that actually it's way easier to interpret from a logical standpoint than it is for me to say, a CFP is 1.4 times the odds more likely to write about regulation and ethics than a non-CFP. You get what I'm saying? Like, I could interpret this and I will in the paper. I will interpret it to be like 2 sentences long. But here, let's just say, okay, so if you're a CFP, are you more likely than not to write about ethics and regulation than a non-CFP? And these are our odds ratios, which essentially tells us if it's above 1, they're more likely than non-CFP, right, to write about this topic, okay? So that is not the most precise way to say this, but essentially what I'm doing when I'm looking through this kind of data mining is I'm saying, okay, what are these really big numbers right here? That's what I'm interested in, because that tells me that this credential is way more likely to write about that topic than not. You with me so far? So when I'm looking at these results, that's what I'm looking for. And so you can see here, oh, wow, this is interesting. At 2.2 times the odds to write about this topic. Ooh, ethics and regulation. Who writes about ethics and regulation more? Lawyers. Oh yeah, that's good. I like that. And guess what? If we look over at the p-value, significant. Ooh, at the 0.00 level, this is what I like to see. Okay, I'm sorry, this is just so fascinating to me. And this is where my wife would say, Jason, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Of course, lawyers write about ethics and regulation. Are you kidding me? But like, I just find this really fascinating, and it gets better. Okay, it gets better. So, who writes about financial planning? Well, let's look at who has really high odds to write about financial planning. Ooh, CFPs, 3.49 times the odds versus non-CFPs to write about financial planning. That's really fascinating. I like that. Well, we're called CFPs, Certified Financial Planners. So we should write more about financial planning. Absolutely. That's really cool. Also, lawyers are more likely to write about financial planning, which I thought was kind of interesting. So anyway, for what it's worth, oh, risk and insurance. We have CLU, right? Do the people who are the top folks in insurance, do they write more about insurance? Well, they do, but actually, similarly, PhDs write about insurance a lot as well, and kind of at the same level. But what's interesting here is, remember, I have two keywords for this one, and the two keywords are risk and insurance. Well, what happens if we just do insurance? This number goes up to like 6 times the odds for CLUs. Oh yeah, that's awesome. That's really fascinating because they're writing about insurance all the time. Well, you would think, right? Because they're chartered life underwriters. They do insurance. This is an insurance designation, and so they should be writing about insurance. Oh, I like that. That's pretty cool. And what's really cool is I haven't really been talking about significance here, but a lot of these are significant at like the 0.00 level, which is really fun. Okay, what about who writes about investing? So the invest keyword, if we look at that, PhDs write about it a lot, which makes sense, right? Because PhDs can tend to write about like finance-based topics. So that one's kind of interesting. Tax. Oh, who writes about tax, my friends? Who do you think? Well, the top 5, unfortunately, CFPs did not make the top 5 credentials, but I may write about it anyway because I can. Nobody can stop me. But who writes a lot about tax? 7 times the odds. Lawyers are 7 times the odds to write about tax. Whoa, that's awesome. That's really cool. And you would expect that, right? We expect lawyers to talk about tax in this space. And then retirement, finally, you can see PhDs write a lot about retirement, which is interesting because in the limitations, I'm probably going to talk about a guy named David Blanchett, okay? Prolific author for JFP. And I would not be surprised if David Blanchett's articles are skewing this number right here. Like I bet you like a huge piece of this PhD number is David Blanchett's articles, no doubt. But kind of interesting. So PhDs write about it a lot. Lawyers are more likely to write about it. Estate planning. Who do you think writes about estate planning? Ding, ding, ding. Lawyers. Oh, yeah. So here we go. 6.8 times the odds. Lawyers write about it all the time. It's what we would expect. That's pretty cool to actually see it. Its significance. What about psychology? Now, this is an interesting one, too. And I think it's interesting from the negation standpoint. So sometimes, and by the way, this is, where am I at on time? I'm getting too excited about this topic. Okay, we're doing good. So first years, sometimes you'll run a regression and Stata will get grumpy and it will say, can't do any work in this area. And so when I ran this regression and I said, interesting, Stata told me I can't do anything here. I said, what's up here? And I kind of had an idea, but remember, we're talking about keywords in psychology in the title and abstract. And so why is it showing 0 here? Well, let's do a crosstab. Lawyers have never written about psychology in the history of ever. Okay. Now, granted, we only have 46 mentions of psychology because it's kind of new in financial planning, right? But I just thought it was funny that lawyers have never in the history of ever in these three journals, they've never written about psychology. Way to go, lawyers. We would expect that too. So that'll be a fun one to report in the study. But who is more likely to talk about it? Well, as you can imagine, CFPs talk about it more than others. Because it's an emerging trend and it's something that we have to start studying for in the CFP exam now. And so CFPs are more likely to talk about that. And actually, Dr. McCoy wants to go to maybe a third level of analysis here and look at like the licensed marriage family therapist and some of the other credentials that don't hit the top 5 that we would expect to be the people that probably wrote these 46 articles. So we may do that as well as a third level. Okay, and that's it. And actually, if you're interested in the machine learning code, Andy Dodo, who did the machine learning coding on this, it's actually available on his GitHub. And so if you want to go and check it out and see what the code looks like for the ML, you can do that. And I do want to make the distinction when we were talking about kind of prediction, that's really the machine learning stuff. The second half of this study, the part 2, is just it's just a logistic regression. It's stuff that you'll learn in your second year. So nothing too fancy there. Okay, that's what I got.
Hey, Jason, I sent you a note on this. This is really good stuff. I just spent this last 6 months doing this stuff that you just outlined in a separate degree. If you ever do anything in the future on this, let me know. I'd love to work with you.
Yeah, I just, when we were going to do this as like one table on that initial journal article thing. And when I saw the data set, I was like, no, I want to do more with this. This looks really cool. And
there's a lot you can do with it.
Yes, yeah. So I convinced my team to let me hold on to it for a couple of years, and I'm just now getting around to doing some stuff. And what's really fun is, you always run this stuff, and sometimes like what you think is going to happen doesn't happen. And like what I thought would happen here is exactly what happened, which is just really cool to see it play out.
Oh, it just shows it works, right? I mean, when it matches common sense, you're like, oh, well, you can trust this stuff a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it was good stuff. Thanks.
Jason, great presentation. I had 2 questions for you. First was related to the machine learning side of things. You didn't talk about, were you training things? And how many years did you train? How many years did you predict? I'm really curious about that. And then,
the code would show that, but I'm pretty sure we did like 10 epochs, right? And so we did 10, I believe we did 10 iterations for each group. So each of the 3 categories that we were training for, I'm pretty sure he did 10 cycles through. And we will write about that in the paper. I was trying to keep it pretty high level since, folks aren't trained in the program on how to do this, but I'm pretty sure it was 10 runs through on the training set.
Gotcha. And then my second question is related to the regression you ran. Did you had to think about multicollinearity at all? It seems, if you're a CFP, you might be a JD as well. And how did you work around that?
Yeah, so a big piece of it is how, again, this is not a perfect lineup of, like if the article was, and this will be in the limitations, but, think about how I measured this. So I am essentially saying that your entire article is about tax. If I can find one keyword in the title and abstract about tax. Well, that's not a guarantee that your article is actually going to be about tax, right? That just says that there's a keyword in one of those 2 areas. And so like over 5,000 records, hopefully that would kind of iron out. But it's not, these are, what we would call proxies, right? Where they're not perfect, but they're a way that we can measure it. And it's just one way. And so the other way, and to get to your point, the other way that we're measuring this is when we're looking at a record, and a record would be an article, right? I'm essentially saying I'm looking at the article listing, and it would say like Jason Anderson, PhD, CPA, CFA, and it would say Kevin Larson, CPA, JD, LLM, or whatever. And so essentially, if that record has JD anywhere across the authors, it's going to be marked as a 1 for JD, right? So it's that binary variable. It would be like count 1 for JD, right? And so I guess there is maybe some multicollinearity in terms of, yes, you're going to have multiple credentials, but we're essentially turning an on-off switch for each of these credentials per record. So like that one record might be on-off switch for 7 credentials, right? And we're only looking at the top 5, but it could be a 1 for all of them. So that's, but then like and it could be that article is
Not a
multiple
tax article.
on the subject too.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there is a lot of crossover here, but I guess I'm just hoping that maybe it falls out over as many records as we have. And of course, it's never going to be there is no perfect way to measure this. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's a good, it exists, but and statistically, I'm able to run it well enough that Stata doesn't gripe at me. So I know that if there was too much multicollinearity between these variables, Stata would not allow me to run it. So I don't know. It is what it is, I guess.
Great presentation. Thanks for taking the questions.
Well, I have one little one. Do you happen to know off the top of your head, like where CPAs kind of fell on the list of the?
Yeah, I think they're like number 6 or 7, so they're close. And actually, if you look at what we've started to write up in the Google Doc, I list in a table the top 10 credentials.
Oh,
good. So CPAs within the top 10. And which again, I think that we likely should write something when it comes to tax about, hey, and by the way, we ran CPA because you're wondering, and CPA is going to be high when it comes to tax and estate planning, some of these other things. So we can definitely run it, but it just wasn't the top 5. and part of that was because I was trying to limit the amount of tables. We're already at 14 because I had to run a regression for each of those topics. And then we have multiple credentials, and so I guess we, we're already at a lot of tables, and so I was trying to like limit the scope a little.
How does it add tables if you, doesn't it just make the tables longer more?
It would, but then it's going to like take more table real estate, right? So, I mean, we can add it pretty easily if we decide we want to do that.
Well,
Hey, Jason, I've got a question, but
yeah,
maybe it's a repeat of Crom's, and I'm not even sure how to ask it. But so if there's someone with a CFP and they're writing something, from my experience, the CHFC is like just you take one more class and you have it.
yeah.
So there's a lot of people that have just the CFP because that's the gold standard, right? But there's a lot of folks just kind of went on and got the other. So does that mean that if they have both, as opposed to the one, it's weighted more towards the CFP? Because the CHFC just seemed kind of vanilla along the whole. Is that?
Yeah, and actually, you're hitting on another thing that astute people will figure out. And maybe they won't because they can't see all the data, but I can see it because I see how this kind of plays out. If you look at the original data, the majority of this, the lion's share of this, is the Journal of Financial Planning. So for instance, I think the Journal of Personal Finance is it's just not that many articles. So if you think about who writes in the Journal of Financial Planning, it's going to skew heavily to CFPs all day long because you have practitioners that are CFPs, you have academics that are CFPs, like basically anybody, anytime that they're going to be listing authors, like you're likely going to have a CFP in that author list. And so just by kind of default, the CFP is going to weigh heavy in all of this because of the weighting of the journals. And so CHFC is likely just not going to play in as much because of the journals that we're looking at, essentially is what I'm saying, and the weighting of how many records we have. Yeah. But I mean, I could show you actually, if somebody else has a question, but what that kind of weighting looks like. Yeah, so some of this we presented and some of it we did not, of course, but here's the actual article that we're starting to write. So you can see, sorry, it's thinking. Here is top author credentials. And so actually this, Dr. McCoy, this answers your question too, but here's CPA. So that's what, 1, 2, here's the end. So they are what, 8, it looks like. And when you look at N, this is the number of credentials that it counts across all authors. So you could have 3 CPAs and 1 record. But when we talk about unique records, that's separate. But you can see here that like we're 3 times CFPs, CHFCs in the records that we're looking at. So that's part of why you're seeing what you're seeing. is because we're weighting 3 times towards CFPs just by the nature of the data.
That's wild. There were so many LLMs. I had to like Google of what the
Yeah, master's of law degree. So those are probably all people who specialize in tax or estate planning.
Jason, how much thought was put into the keywords? Like, how did you filter down to the 1 or 2 keywords that you use for each of those representations?
Best judgment. So there is a justification, and the justification is that we've done previous research that looked at the top keywords in JFP, which is the majority of the records here. And so we did start with citing myself, which is nice. But cited our previous research and said, hey, we've seen these keywords. And by the way, many of these keywords align with the CFP knowledge requirements. And so then it was about like what keyword might encapsulate the knowledge requirements. Sometimes very obvious, like for estate planning, it's estates. But sometimes it wasn't and actually I would run keywords and then I'd think about different combinations that might actually play out and I'd change them. So like I started with investing plus investor, and then I was like, why don't I just do invest, Or then I thought about risk management and I was like, well, risk. And by the way, I also have the keywords, which is kind of interesting. So across these, and when I thought through what this looks like, I actually have the number of keywords charted out too. So like it's kind of interesting when you look at the like risk and insurance are kind of equal, but some of them are not. Like here, ethics only 44 hits, but regulation had 152. So that's also why I kind of go through and do some of these more minutia stuff. And so like for right here, risk and insurance, but if you run just for insurance, the CLU odds go way up. So there's kind of some interesting quirk stuff. And again, I find it to be very fascinating, but if we're talking about precision, some of these things are not very precise. Like it's the best we can do, but they're not very precise.
Yeah, and the risk and insurance one was the one that piqued my interest, just because you think about investment risk maybe different than an insurable risk.
Yeah, you got it.
And you would that with it's not pure. Is there any intention or thoughts to, like on the one side, rather than looking at title and abstract, to having some sort of a sentiment analysis or a machine learn sort of thrust of the article as the indicator of what it's about, rather than
the sentiment analysis wouldn't quite get at that. The machine learning analysis does, however. That's kind of why there's 2 pieces to this. There could be a chance, I haven't talked with Andy about this, but we could maybe replicate like part 2 credentials instead of groupings, right? That might be an interesting one to do. But it might also undermine the results of our second half. So, it's part of this, and you're going to realize I'm a very practical guy, Tom. And so sometimes I get to the point where I hit a threshold where I think it's publishable, and then I let the reviewer tell me what I should be doing, like I just submit it and I'm like, we'll see what happens. So this is kind of one of those points where it's like, could I keep doing analyses that are maybe more precise? Sure, but I'm probably going to submit it and see what happens. Yeah. For better or for worse.
I hear you there. One more quick question, if I may, and it's just my lack of familiarity with odds ratio, but the ethics and regulation, each one of the top 5 had an odds ratio of over 1.
Yeah.
And the control would be everybody that's not in the top 5, or how do you think about that control? And how do you think
the control, since it's bivariate, the control is not having that credential in the author list.
Okay.
Makes sense. And then, so the odds, and that's why I was kind of getting at, this is one of the few times where it's easier just to look at it and kind of intuitively know what's going on versus me saying, okay, it is 2.5 times the odds for a CFP in the article line to have to write about a tax keyword within the title and abstract line versus someone who doesn't have a CFP in the article line, or no CFPs being in the article line. Like there's a precise way to interpret that, but it gets hairy really quick. And so really think of the control as the CFP not existing in the author line.
Sure, makes sense.
Yeah, but I will write it out in the paper, but it's going to be ridiculous. Like it's going to be a paragraph of interpretation of the odds ratios. Like it's going to be, because it's all proxy. Like I've basically proxied this together into a glued together something that's really fascinating, but it's not very precise. So it kind of gets at what we're wanting to study. But again, you can't gauge this with complete precision.
Any last questions for Jason? Going once, going twice. All right, Jason, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Great stuff.
Thanks for
And,
having me. Appreciate it.
It was great to learn. If anybody has any questions, can you post your email in the chat?
Yeah, definitely. It's just first name, last name at ksu.edu.
Kansas State, I don't think allows you to email Kansas, so that might be an issue.
Yeah, that's right. We have an automatic blocker for at ksu.edu.
Yeah, I think those get automatically rejected and sent back.
That's right. Or
And,
sent to our local spam specialist, really,
Yeah.
I think. So we send it immediately to the dark web.
Yep. Good. Awesome. Well, thanks, Jason. Thanks again. Thanks, Dr. McCoy, for jumping on, and really appreciate everybody's participation. And I'll see everybody next week. Thanks.
Thanks.